St. Mary's Hospital, 3:17 a.m., October 15, 1991. Night shift supervisor Margaret Chen began her final rounds. 23 staff members were on duty: nurses, orderlies, security guards, even the janitor mopping the third floor. By 6 a.m., when the day shift arrived, the hospital was completely empty. No patients were harmed, the equipment still hummed, but every single employee had vanished without a trace. Subscribe to the Ember Files, where the disappeared leave their stories behind. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune through the corridors of St. Mary's Hospital. As Margaret Chen clipped her pen to her clipboard and stepped out of the nurse's station. October nights in Cedar Valley carried a chill that seemed to seep through the hospital's brick walls, but inside, the building maintained its steady pulse of life-sustaining activity. Margaret had supervised night shifts for 12 years. She knew the rhythm by heart, the soft beep of monitors, the whisper of ventilators, the gentle squeak of orthopedic shoes against polished linoleum. Tonight felt no different than any other. At 3:17 a.m., she began her routine final rounds. 23 staff members were scattered throughout the 4-story building, each attending to their assigned duties. Nurses Sarah Martinez and David Kim monitored patients on the 3rd floor. Dr. Patterson was completing his residency rotation in the emergency department. Security guard Williams walked his scheduled perimeter check. Even old Henry, the night janitor, was methodically mopping the corridors with the same measured pace he'd maintained for 15 years. Margaret checked her watch. 3:22 a.m. She moved through the ICU, noting that Mrs. Brennan in bed 7 was sleeping peacefully, her vital signs stable. Nurse Martinez was adjusting an IV drip for the patient in bed 12, her movements precise and practiced. "Everything quiet up here?" Margaret asked softly. Sarah looked up and smiled. "All good. Mr. Rodriguez's pain levels are finally manageable. I think he'll sleep through until morning." Margaret nodded and continued down the hallway. The night was progressing exactly as expected. In the emergency department, Dr. Patterson was reviewing X-rays for a patient who'd been admitted earlier with a suspected broken wrist. The young resident looked tired but alert, his stethoscope draped around his neck like a badge of dedication. "How's our fracture case?" Margaret inquired. "Clean break, nothing complicated," Patterson replied without looking up from the films. "I'll have him discharged by morning." Margaret made a note on her clipboard and moved on. The 2nd floor housed the medical ward, where Nurse Thompson was administering midnight medications to a post-surgical patient. Her cart was neatly organized, each medication checked and double-checked against the patient charts. "Mrs. Chen," Thompson called out quietly. "Room 218 is asking for water. Should I check with dietary about his fluid restrictions?" "He's cleared for normal intake," Margaret answered. "Go ahead." Security guard Williams passed them in the hallway, his flashlight clipped to his belt, radio crackling softly with periodic check-ins from the main desk. "Oh, all clear on 2, he reported into his handset. "Copy that, Williams." "Proceed to basement level," came the response from Officer Martinez at the security desk. Margaret watched Williams disappear into the stairwell, then continued her rounds. The 1st floor held the emergency department, administrative offices, and the main lobby where overnight receptionist Janet Foster sat behind the curved information desk. Janet had worked nights at St. Mary's for 8 years, and her presence provided a sense of stability that both staff and late-night visitors found comforting. "Quiet night?" Margaret asked as she passed the reception area. "Just the way I like it," Janet replied, not looking up from her crossword puzzle. "Though Mr. Henderson in 104 keeps asking for his glasses. I think his son forgot them when he visited earlier." Margaret made another note. She descended to the basement level, where the building's infrastructure hummed steadily. Boiler room, laundry facilities, storage areas, and the morgue occupied this level. It was here that much of the hospital's essential but invisible work took place. Henry, the janitor, was methodically mopping the corridor near the laundry room. His routine never varied: start at the far end, work toward the elevators, empty trash bins, check supply closets. He'd been performing the same tasks in the same order for 15 years. "Evening, Henry," Margaret said. He looked up, his weathered face breaking into a gentle smile. "Evening, Mrs. Chen. Quiet night for cleaning. It's always good for the patients." Margaret completed her circuit and returned to the nurses' station on the 3rd floor. Her watch read 3:45 a.m. Everything was functioning normally. 23 staff members were at their posts, patients were stable, and the hospital maintained its steady rhythm of care. She settled at her desk to complete the overnight documentation. Patient status reports, medication logs, incident reports, thankfully none tonight, and staffing notes. The paperwork was routine, but essential, creating the permanent record of each shift's activities. At 3:47 a.m., Margaret reached for her coffee cup. What happened next would confound investigators for decades. When day shift supervisor Linda Rodriguez arrived at 6 a.m. on October 16th, she expected to find Margaret waiting with the handoff report. Instead, she found the nurses' station abandoned. Margaret's coffee cup sat half empty on the desk, still warm. Her clipboard lay open to a partially completed patient note, the pen resting on the paper as if she'd been interrupted mid-sentence. Linda called out, "Margaret? Where are you?" No response. She walked down the 3rd floor corridor, checking each room. Patients were sleeping peacefully, but there were no staff members anywhere. In room 312, Mrs. Rodriguez's 4th bag hung empty, the pump beeping softly to indicate it needed changing. Someone should have noticed that alarm. Linda descended to the 2nd floor. Nurse Thompson's medication cart stood in the middle of the hallway, its drawers partially open. A syringe lay on the counter, prepared but not administered. The patient in room 218 was calling for assistance, but no one was responding. Growing alarmed, Linda made her way to the emergency department. Dr. Patterson's X-ray films were still mounted on the viewing box, as if he'd stepped away momentarily. His coffee cup sat beside a half-completed discharge form. The patient he'd been treating was awake and confused, asking where the doctor had gone. At the reception desk, Janet Foster's crossword puzzle lay open to a half-completed section. Her purse was in the drawer, her keys on the desk. A patient's family member was pressing the call button at the desk, trying to get someone's attention. Linda ran to the basement. Henry's mop bucket sat in the middle of the corridor, water slowly cooling. His cleaning cart was positioned exactly where it would be during his normal routine, but Henry was nowhere to be found. By 6:15 a.m., Linda had confirmed the impossible. Every single night shift employee had vanished, not just left their posts, vanished entirely. Security guard Williams was gone. The security desk officer who'd been taking radio calls was gone. 23 people had simply disappeared. Linda called the police, then the hospital administration, then began the complex process of ensuring patient care continued, despite having no information about what had happened to the night staff. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at 7:30 a.m. He'd worked missing persons cases for 15 years, but this was unlike anything he'd encountered. "No signs of struggle," he noted as he examined the nurses' station. "No evidence of forced entry or exit. Everything looks like people just stopped what they were doing." He reviewed the security footage. The hospital had cameras in most corridors, the lobby and the emergency entrances. The recordings showed normal activity until 3:47 a.m. At that moment, every camera that had been showing staff members suddenly showed empty hallways. "This is impossible," Morrison muttered, rewinding the footage. At 3:46, Nurse Martinez is visible in the ICU corridor. At 3:47, she's gone. Same timestamp, same thing happens throughout the building. 23 people, simultaneously gone. The investigation expanded. State police arrived, followed by federal agents when the case was classified as a potential mass abduction. They interviewed every day shift employee, every patient who'd been conscious, every family member who'd visited during the night. The patients' accounts were consistent but disturbing. Those who'd been awake reported that staff members had been present and attentive up until around 3:47 a.m. Then, suddenly, no one responded to call buttons. No one came for scheduled medication rounds. The building felt empty. Mrs. Eleanor Wright in room 314 provided the most detailed account. "I pressed my call button at 3:50 because I needed pain medication. The light went on, but no one came. I kept pressing it every few minutes. Around 4:30, I got worried and tried to get up to look for someone. The hallway was completely empty. It felt like being alone in a haunted house. Federal agents questioned whether the disappearance could be related to national security. St. Mary's was a civilian hospital, but it did occasionally treat government employees and military personnel. Background checks on all missing staff revealed nothing suspicious. They were ordinary people with ordinary lives. The security footage was analyzed frame by frame. Digital experts confirmed the recordings hadn't been tampered with. The timestamps were accurate. The images showed real-time documentation of 23 people simultaneously vanishing from existence. Weeks passed. The FBI established a task force. Missing persons reports were filed across state and national databases. Financial records were monitored for any activity on the missing employees' accounts. Bank cards were never used, phones never answered. Cars remained in the hospital parking lot, keys still in Margaret Chen's desk drawer. Family members were devastated and confused. Margaret's husband, Robert, told investigators, "She came home every morning at 6:30. Never missed a day in 12 years. This isn't like her. Something terrible happened." Sarah Martinez's mother flew in from California. "Sarah called me every Sunday. She was planning her wedding for next spring. She wouldn't just leave without telling anyone." The hospital administration struggled with the practical implications. How do you replace an entire night shift? How do you explain to families that their loved ones simply vanished? How do you maintain public confidence in the institution? Dr. Harrison, the hospital administrator, held press conferences but had no answers to offer. "We're cooperating fully with law enforcement. Our primary concern is ensuring continued quality care for our patients. We cannot speculate about what happened to our colleagues, but we hope for their safe return." Months turned to years. The case remained open but inactive. New staff were hired. Night shifts resumed. The hospital functioned normally, but employees reported an unsettling atmosphere during overnight hours. Security guards complained of feeling watched. Nurses mentioned hearing footsteps in empty corridors. Patients sometimes claimed they'd seen staff members who matched descriptions of the missing employees. In 1995, the hospital installed additional security cameras and upgraded to a digital recording system. In 1998, a memorial plaque was placed in the lobby honoring the missing staff members. In 2003, the case was officially classified as cold. But Robert Chen, Margaret's husband, never stopped searching for answers. For 30 years, Robert maintained a meticulous investigation of his own. He collected every piece of documentation related to the case: police reports, witness statements, security footage, hospital records. He interviewed family members of other missing staff. He researched similar cases nationwide. In 2018, Robert discovered something the original investigators had missed. St. Mary's Hospital had been built in 1967 on land previously owned by the Cedar Valley Research Institute, a private facility that had operated from 1952 to 1966. The institute's records were sealed, but Robert found a former employee living in Florida. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins had been a research psychologist at the institute. She agreed to speak with Robert, but only off the record. "We studied sleep disorders," Dr. Hawkins explained during their phone conversation. "But toward the end, the funding came from some very unusual sources: government contracts, military applications. They wanted to understand consciousness, memory, perception of time." "What kind of experiments did you conduct?" Robert asked. Dr. Hawkins was quiet for a long time. "Things that would be considered unethical today. We worked with volunteers initially, but later, the subject pool changed. We had access to people who wouldn't be missed. Transients, patients from closed psychiatric facilities. The work became more invasive." Robert felt his pulse quicken. "What happened to the institute?" "It was shut down suddenly in 1966. All records were confiscated. Staff were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. I left the field entirely after that." "Do you think what happened at the hospital could be connected to the institute's work?" Another long pause. "I think some experiments never really end, Mr. Chen. They just go dormant until conditions are right to activate again." Robert contacted Detective Morrison, who had retired but agreed to meet. Morrison listened to Robert's theory, then shook his head. "Robert, I understand you need answers, but this sounds like science fiction. People don't just vanish into thin air." "Then explain the security footage," Robert challenged. "Explain how 23 people simultaneously disappeared from a locked building with no exits used." Morrison had no answer. In 2021, St. Mary's Hospital was sold to a larger healthcare system. The new owners planned extensive renovations, including updating the basement infrastructure. Asbestos removal and foundation work would require accessing areas of the building that hadn't been disturbed since original construction. Robert Chen, now 78, requested permission to observe the renovation work. He'd spent 30 years searching for answers, and this might be his last opportunity. On March 15, 2024, demolition crews breaching the basement discovered something that had been sealed behind a false wall for decades. A room that didn't appear on any hospital blueprint. Inside were banks of electronic equipment, recording devices from the 1960s, and 23 filing cabinets labeled with the names of the missing staff members. Robert Chen stood at the threshold of the hidden room, tears streaming down his face. Each filing cabinet contained detailed psychological profiles, medical records, and behavioral analyses of the missing employees. The documents were dated from 1989 to 1991, 2 years before the disappearance. At the bottom of Margaret's file was a single sheet of paper with an official seal. Subject profiles complete. Activation scheduled for October 15, 1991, 0347 hours. Memory suppression protocol tested and approved. Transfer to secondary facility authorized. It was signed by Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins. Robert collapsed into a chair, the weight of 33 years crashing over him. Margaret and her colleagues hadn't vanished. They had been taken, selected, studied, and removed according to a plan that had been in motion for years. But taken where? And by whom? The final document in the room was a shipping manifest, dated October 16, 1991. 23 containers, destination listed as Cedar Valley Underground Research Extension, Sub-Level 7, an address that, according to city records, didn't exist. Robert Chen called Detective Morrison one last time. "Ray," he said quietly into the phone, "I found them. I found what happened to Margaret and the others." "What did you find, Robert?" "They were never missing. They were collected. Because sometimes the people we trust to heal us are the ones being healed by someone else. This is the story of the vanishing hospital shift. And somewhere beneath Cedar Valley, 23 people are still clocking in for a shift that never ends. Subscribe to the Ember Files. Some patients never get discharged.